Queen Camilla crossed a royal guard. The consequences shocked the entire palace. The call came in at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, and by 10 o'clock, 3 senior palace officials were already standing in a corridor outside the press office with their phones face down and their voices low. Something had gone wrong, not the kind of wrong that gets smoothed over with a quiet word and a polished statement, the kind of wrong that travels, the kind that lands on front pages before the afternoon tea is even poured. It had started the night before. A woman had walked into Buckingham Palace, not a tourist, not a protester, not a stranger who had stumbled through the wrong gate. She had been invited, she had been welcomed. She had a name badge, a reason to be there, and a cause that the palace itself had asked her to represent. She had dressed with care, carried herself with dignity, and arrived ready to do the very thing she had been called to do. She left having to fight for something she should never have had to fight for inside those walls. The story of what happened at Camilla's reception that November evening in 2022 did not explode immediately. It began quietly on a phone screen in a Twitter thread, but by the next morning the thread had been read by hundreds of thousands of people. By the afternoon, it had been picked up by every major news outlet in Britain. By evening, it had crossed the Atlantic. By the time palace officials finished their corridor meeting, the damage was already done, and no statement, however carefully worded, was going to put the genie back in the bottle. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand who Camilla was by that point. Not the caricature, not the tabloid villain. The real woman with the real history who had spent the better part of 20 years building something new out of the rubble of her public reputation. Camilla Rosemary Shand was born in London in July 1947 into a comfortable, well-connected family. She was not raised inside the royal machine. She was not groomed for a palace. She was a girl who loved horses and books and the outdoors, who grew up with the kind of confidence that comes not from titles but from being genuinely liked by the people around her. She was funny, she was warm, she was the sort of person who remembered what you told her last time and asked about it the next. She met Charles in the early 1970s when both of them were young and the world was different and the future still felt like something that could be shaped. What passed between them then, the attraction, the connection, the way they seemed to fit, was real. But the world they lived in was not interested in what was real. It was interested in what was appropriate. And Camilla, by the reckoning of the palace and the press and the powerful people who arranged such things, was not appropriate. She was not the right kind of girl for the heir to the throne. She was not from the right family. She had not been kept carefully apart from the world in the way that future queens were supposed to be kept. And so, when the time came for Charles to marry, he did not marry Camilla. He married Diana Spencer, and the world fell in love with Diana, and Camilla receded into the background of a story she had never quite left. What happened over the years that followed is a matter of history. The marriage between Charles and Diana broke apart slowly and then, in the way these things go, all at once. Both of them had spoken in recordings and interviews about the loneliness and the pain of that marriage. Both of them had sought comfort elsewhere. But when the truth came out publicly, the blame did not fall equally. Diana was the princess. Diana was the one the public loved, and Camilla was the other woman, the name said with a certain tone of voice, the face shown in photographs with a certain slant of disapproval. She could not go to a grocery store without being followed. She could not attend a public function without someone shouting something ugly at her. Protesters threw bread rolls at her car in 1995. Bread rolls. The image was almost comic if it had not been so relentless, this woman, chased through her own life by a public that had decided it knew who she was. The thing about Camilla, though, was that she did not collapse. She did not retreat entirely. She did not sell her story or grant tearful interviews or position herself as a victim. She simply kept going. She kept showing up. She worked. She championed causes, osteoporosis, because her mother and grandmother had suffered from it, and that was personal. Later, literacy, because she had always believed in the power of reading to change a life. And later still, the cause that would become most central to her public identity, and most painfully ironic in light of what happened in November 2022. She began speaking about sexual harm, about what happens to women who are silenced, dismissed, not believed. She had a reason to care about that subject that was not widely known at the time, a reason that was quiet and her own. She had experienced something frightening as a teenager on a train when a man had sat too close and moved his hand and she had fought back hard with her heel. She had gotten off the train with her hair standing on end and a button missing from her coat, and her mother had looked at her and asked what had happened, and the anger she had felt in that moment had never entirely left her. She carried it, she used it. By 2022, Camilla had been married to Charles for 17 years. Queen Elizabeth, in her Platinum Jubilee message, had expressed her sincere hope that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort when Charles became king. that was not a small thing. That was the old queen who had been cool toward Camilla for years, extending something that looked very much like acceptance. The public, too, had shifted. The hatred had not disappeared, but it had softened. People who had once thrown bread rolls were now, if not exactly fans, at least willing to see a more complicated picture. Camilla was building a legacy. She was doing it carefully, one engagement at a time, one cause at a time, one handshake at a time. She was not flashy about it. She did not have Diana's quality of making every room feel like it had been lit specifically for her. But she had something that wore well over time. She was consistent. She was genuine. She showed up when it was uncomfortable to show up. The reception she hosted on the evening of November 29, 2022, was part of that work. It was organized around the United Nations' 16 Days of Activism Against Violence Against Women and Girls, a global campaign that runs from the end of November into early December each year. The guest list was made up of campaigners and charity leaders and advocates, women who had given significant portions of their lives to protecting other women from harm. Among them was a woman named Ngozi Fulani. She was the founder and chief executive of Sista Space, a refuge organization based in East London that provided specialist support to women of African and Caribbean heritage who had been affected by harm. It was not a large organization in terms of budget or staff, but it was doing work that larger organizations were not doing, reaching women who often fell through the gaps of more mainstream services. Ngozi had built it herself with her own energy and her own conviction, and she had kept it running through the kind of obstacles that would have stopped most people. She had been invited to the palace that evening because the work she did mattered, because the cause Camilla had organized the reception around was the cause Ngozi had built her life around. There was an alignment there, a shared purpose, or what should have been a shared purpose. She arrived in traditional African dress, wearing her hair in locks. She carried herself the way a person carries herself when she knows why she is there and is not afraid of the room. She signed in, she collected her name badge, she entered the reception. What happened next did not take long. It did not happen in a corner or in private. It happened at a royal event inside Buckingham Palace, in a room full of people who had gathered to talk about the importance of protecting women from harm. A senior palace figure approached Ngozi. She reached out and moved Ngozi's locks aside, just moved them, without asking, as though the woman standing in front of her was not a person who might have feelings about being touched without permission, in order to read the name badge pinned underneath. And then she began to ask questions. The questions were about where Ngozi was from. Ngozi said she was British. The woman asked where she was really from. Ngozi said she was born in Britain and had lived here all her life. The woman asked where her people were from. Ngozi said her heritage was African and Caribbean. The woman responded with something close to satisfaction, as if she had finally gotten to the bottom of something that had been puzzling her. Ngozi described it afterward as an interrogation. Not a conversation, not curiosity, an interrogation. She stayed for the rest of the event. She did not make a scene. She did not leave. She smiled where smiling was required and spoke where speaking was expected, and somewhere inside her something was burning. She had come to a palace event about the harm done to women. She had been welcomed into a room meant to honor advocates, and she had been made to feel, by a person who operated at the heart of that institution, that her right to be in the room needed to be established and justified and traced all the way back to somewhere else. She got home that night and she wrote it down, not as a complaint, not as a press release, as a record. She posted it on social media, laid out the exchange beat by beat, and by the time she went to sleep, it had already begun to travel. By morning, the palace was in crisis, and the consequences were about to surprise everyone, including the people who thought they already knew how these things went. The palace moved fast. Within hours of Ngozi's post going wide, a statement was issued. The remarks were called unacceptable and deeply regrettable. An internal investigation was announced. The palace reached out to Ngozi directly, expressing regret and inviting her to speak with them in person. And then the most significant consequence of all, the senior figure who had approached Ngozi at the reception, Lady Susan Hussey, a woman who had served the royal family for decades, who was godmother to the Prince of Wales himself, resigned from her honorary position with the royal household. Just like that, gone. The resignation sent a signal. It said, "This is not something we are going to minimize or manage quietly." It said, the remarks were indefensible and the person who made them is stepping away. But it also raised a question that the statement did not answer, and that Ngozi herself would raise publicly in the days that followed. The question was not about Lady Hussey. The question was about the institution, about the room, about why inside a palace at an event organized to honor women who fought for the dignity of other women, something like this could happen at all. That question did not go away just because a resignation had been announced. If anything, it got louder. The morning after the story broke, Ngozi Fulani appeared on television. She was calm, she was clear. She did not overstate what had happened, and she did not minimize it either. She described the exchange the way she had written it, methodically, precisely, without embellishment. She said that what she had experienced felt like violence, not the kind that leaves marks on the body, the other kind. She said that when a person touches your hair without asking, without even acknowledging that you might have an opinion about being touched, they are treating you as something less than fully human. And when that same person then proceeds to question your right to call yourself British, to question where you really come from, to push and push until they have located you somewhere else, somewhere foreign, somewhere other, they are doing something that has a long and painful history behind it, whether they intend to or not. Intention, Ngozi said, was not the same as impact. Those words landed. They landed in the studios where journalists were discussing the story. They landed in the homes of people watching the coverage. They landed, presumably, inside the palace itself, where the work of figuring out what came next was already underway. Lady Susan Hussey was 83 years old. She had served the royal family for more than 60 years. She had been appointed a lady of the household relatively recently, following the death of Queen Elizabeth, and that appointment had been seen as a kind of tribute, a recognition of a lifetime of loyal service. She was not a peripheral figure. She was, as one royal expert put it, someone who operated at the very heart of the royal household. Her resignation was not a small administrative footnote. It was a significant moment, and it was being watched closely. Prince William's office issued a statement saying that racism had no place in society. It was direct and unequivocal, the kind of statement his communications team clearly believed left no room for misinterpretation, and perhaps it didn't. But what it also did, quite inadvertently, was draw a sharper line under the incident at precisely the moment when the Prince and Princess of Wales were in Boston in the United States in front of American cameras, handing out awards for the Earthshot Prize. The timing could not have been worse. Every question asked at the Boston events had to compete with every headline back home. Camilla herself said nothing publicly, not in those first days. There was no statement in her name beyond what the palace had already issued. She was the one who had organized the event. Her name was on the invitation. Her cause was the one that had brought Ngozi Fulani to the palace in the first place. But in the immediate aftermath, she was publicly silent, and that silence, while almost certainly advised by the same communications team managing every other aspect of the crisis, was noticed. Some people read the silence as discomfort. Others read it as an appropriate institutional restraint. Either way, the silence existed, and Ngozi was still out there speaking. Ngozi told interviewers that the palace had not contacted her in the hours immediately after the incident became public. She said she had heard from them eventually, that the invitation to meet had been extended, and that she was open to that conversation. But she also said something else, something that cut through the official language of apologies and investigations. She said she and her charity had suffered as a direct result of what happened, not just emotionally, practically. The organization she had built, the one she had brought to the palace that evening as a representative of the women it served, was taking damage. Because here is the part of the story that got lost in some of the coverage. The torrent of response that came for Ngozi after she posted her account was not entirely supportive. There were people who defended Lady Hussey. There were people who dismissed Ngozi's experience as oversensitivity. There were people who sent messages that were not merely unkind but genuinely hostile. The palace, in its joint statement, would later describe this as an appalling torrent of abuse on social media and elsewhere. Those words were carefully chosen and they were accurate. Ngozi had done nothing except tell the truth about what happened to her inside a palace, and a portion of the public responded by making her life harder than it already was. She stepped down temporarily from her role as chief executive of Sista Space. Let that sit for a moment. The woman who had been wronged, the woman who had been invited to the palace as an honored guest, as a voice for vulnerable women, the woman who had told her story clearly and without malice. She was the one who ended up stepping away from her own organization. Not permanently and not under pressure from the palace. She made that decision herself because the weight of the fallout had become too heavy to carry while also running a refuge organization that needed her at full capacity. She said the palace could have done more to intervene, to help absorb some of what she was being subjected to. She said she had hoped for more active support. She said she had not received it in the way she had hoped. The palace was now in the position of having to respond not just to the original incident, but to the ongoing harm being done to the very person they had already apologized to. It was a cascade. Each response generated new questions. Each statement opened up new territory that needed to be addressed. King Charles and Camilla extended a personal invitation to Ngozi to come to the palace and meet with them directly, not with a communications official, not with a spokesperson, with the king and queen consort themselves. That was not a standard move. That was an acknowledgement that this required more than institutional language. It required a human response. Meanwhile, across London at Sista Space, the women the organization served were watching all of this unfold. Women who had come to that refuge because the world had already treated them as less than fully visible. Women who had been doubted, dismissed, or made to justify their pain by people who were supposed to help them. For those women, the story of what happened to Ngozi at the palace was not abstract. It was familiar. It was the same feeling with a different backdrop. That was arguably the most significant consequence of the whole episode. Not the resignation, not the statements, not the meetings. The fact that a reception organized to shine a light on harm done to women had, in a single conversation, managed to demonstrate exactly the kind of harm it was supposed to be fighting against. And the women who lived with that harm every day could see it clearly, even if others needed it explained. The media coverage continued to build. Journalists who covered the royal family were writing about institutional culture. Opinion writers were asking whether the palace's diversity commitments were real or decorative. Scholars who studied race and belonging in Britain were being invited onto radio programs to provide context. The conversation had widened far beyond Lady Hussey or even Ngozi. It had become a conversation about the country. Camilla's charity work, which had been her vehicle for redemption and her most sincere contribution to public life, was now being viewed through a complicated lens. The cause she had championed, the safety and dignity of women, had been undermined at her own event. That did not make the cause less important. It did not erase the real work she had done over many years, but it placed her legacy, the one she had been building so carefully, in an uncomfortable context. She was the queen consort. She would soon be queen. The palace she was stepping into was not just a building. It was a set of practices, habits, assumptions, and relationships that had accumulated over centuries. Lady Hussey had not appeared from nowhere. She had been at the center of that institution for 60 years. Her assumptions had been formed inside those walls, shaped by that world. If Camilla genuinely believed in the causes she had made her own, then the incident at her reception was not just a public relations problem. It was a personal challenge. It was the institution she now represented making visible, at her event, the exact patterns of behavior she had said she wanted to fight. What she would do with that, how she would respond, what she would actually change, whether the enhanced diversity and inclusion programs the palace announced would be real or performative, none of that was yet clear. What was clear was that Ngozi Fulani had walked into Buckingham Palace as a guest and walked out carrying something heavier than she had arrived with. And the palace, for all its centuries of practice at managing difficult moments, was going to have to sit with that. In mid-December 2022, Lady Susan Hussey walked into Buckingham Palace for a meeting. She did not come in through the public entrance. She came in the way people come in when they have been connected to that building for most of their adult lives. She had spent 60 years in service to the royal family. She had been there through coronations and funerals and marriages and births. She had watched the monarchy change and bend and hold. She had watched the world outside change faster than the world inside. Now she was here to meet the woman she had interrogated at a reception 3 weeks earlier, the woman who had told the world what happened, and the world had believed her. Ngozi Fulani arrived separately. She was not someone who needed a palace to give her legitimacy. She had built her legitimacy herself, year by year, through the work she did for women the system had often preferred to ignore. She came to this meeting because she had said publicly that she was open to it, and she was a woman of her word. The two of them sat together inside the building where the incident had begun. The palace issued a joint statement afterward. It described the meeting as warm and understanding. It said Lady Hussey had offered her sincere apologies. It said Ngozi had accepted those apologies and understood that no deliberate harm had been intended. It said that both women hoped their example might show others that resolution was possible, and asked to be left in peace to rebuild their lives in the wake of what had been an immensely difficult period for them both. The word warm was interesting. 3 weeks earlier, the same institution had called Lady Hussey's remarks unacceptable and deeply regrettable. Now the meeting between the two parties was warm and understanding. Both things were true, perhaps. The remarks could be unacceptable and the apology could be sincere. A person can cause real harm without malice, and that harm can still be real even after the apology. These things are not mutually exclusive. But the use of the word warm carried something else too. It carried the palace's characteristic impulse to smooth things over, to find the resolution that allows everyone to move forward without leaving anything too jagged or unresolved in the record. It was the language of closure. And closure, for an institution like this one, has always been easier to declare than to actually achieve. The statement also announced something more structural. The palace said it would be launching an enhanced program of work focused on inclusion and diversity. It said this program would extend training and knowledge sharing across all members of the royal household. It said the palace would draw specifically on what could be learned from Sista Space, from Ngozi's own organization, in shaping that program. The people at the center of the incident were being formally recognized as a source of knowledge rather than merely a source of embarrassment. Whether that recognition was genuine or strategic, or whether it was possible to be both at the same time, was a question observers were already asking. King Charles and Camilla met with Ngozi separately. The details of that meeting were not made public. There was no statement, no photograph released to the press, no timed announcement about what had been discussed or agreed. It was private, which was either a mark of respect for Ngozi's dignity or a sign that the palace preferred this particular piece of the story to remain quiet, or both. What was known was that the meeting happened, that the king and his wife sat down with the woman whose experience at their reception had shaken the institution and made headlines around the world, that they did not send a representative, that they showed up. For Camilla, that meeting was the most complex part of all of this, because the cause at the center of the story, the safety, dignity, and full humanity of women who had been overlooked and dismissed, was her cause. She had not adopted it strategically, or at least not only strategically. She had arrived at it through her own experiences, including the one she rarely spoke about, the one from her teenage years, the anger she had carried for decades after a stranger on a train had treated her as though she had no right to her own body. She knew what it felt like to be made to feel small in a public space. She knew what it felt like to have your version of events questioned. She knew the particular exhaustion of having to prove yourself in rooms that were not entirely sure they wanted you in them. And yet the room she now occupied, the room she had worked so hard to reach, the room with the title and the responsibility and the platform, was a room with its own long history of making certain kinds of people feel exactly that way. The room that had 3 weeks before the December meeting done precisely that to a woman Camilla had invited in. The palace's announcement about diversity training and the Sista Space partnership was welcomed by some and viewed with caution by others. Organizations that work in this space know the difference between training that changes behavior and training that allows an institution to say it has addressed a problem without actually changing anything fundamental. The proof, as it always is in these cases, would be in what happened next. In whether the patterns that produced the original incident were actually disrupted, or whether the incident was simply absorbed and filed away, and the patterns quietly reasserted themselves. Ngozi, for her part, returned to her work. She came back to Sista Space. She continued to show up for the women her organization served. She gave interviews in the months that followed in which she spoke carefully and with precision about what the experience had taught her and what she hoped would change. She was not bitter, or at least not publicly so. She was watchful. The women at Sista Space, the ones who used the refuge, who called the helpline, who sat across from support workers and tried to put words to what had been done to them, those women had followed the story from the beginning. Some of them had recognized it immediately. They knew about being asked where you really came from. They knew about being touched without permission. They knew about the kind of question that sounds polite on its surface, but carries something harder underneath. They knew about having their right to exist in a space questioned by someone who did not think they were doing anything wrong. For them, the story of what happened at the palace was not a headline. It was a language they already spoke. And the fact that it had happened there, in that building, at that event, in that room, that was the thing that would not go away. Long after the statements were issued and the meeting was held and the training programs were announced, that fact remained. Camilla's reception, designed to champion women and to stand alongside those who worked to protect them, had become something else as well. It had become a demonstration of how deeply the patterns the reception was meant to oppose had taken root, not in dark corners or hidden places, but at the center, in the light, in a room full of people who believed they were on the right side. What the palace did with that demonstration, over the months and years that followed, was the story that had not yet been written. What Camilla did with it, the the woman who had built her second chance on the belief that people could be more than their worst moments, was perhaps the most interesting question of all. Because she had been given a chance to prove it, not about herself this time, about the institution she now led. About whether the palace, with its centuries of habits and its layers of hierarchy, and its long, complicated relationship with who belongs and who does not, could actually do what she had spent years telling the world it should do. The appointment had been announced, the training had been promised, the apology had been delivered in person in a room described as warm. Whether warmth was enough was something only time would answer. And the women who had been watching, the ones in East London, the ones who had found their way to Sister Space, the ones who knew what it felt like to be asked to prove your place in a room that should already have been yours, they were going to be watching too. They had always been watching. The difference now was that the palace knew it.